thank you for waiting. I'm going to start this high-level panel on funders' research assessment processes. My name is Mark Schultz. I'm the chief executive of the Luxembourg National Research Fund, but I'm also the current president of Science Europe, which is the European association that brings together all national research funding and major research performing organizations. And of course, research assessment processes is something that we have been working on for quite some time, and I'll say a few words about our most recent work on that. Let me also briefly introduce who is with me on the panel today. We have Professor Angelika Kalt, who is the director of the Swiss National Science Foundation, and she's going to talk or present in particular the use of narrative CVs in research assessment processes. We have also Professor Jane Catherine Gilla, who is Deputy Vice Chancellor of Riara University and member of the African Academy of Sciences. And she will cover topics at the intersection of equality, diversity, and inclusion in research assessment. We have with us Dr. Sandeep Verma, Secretary of Science and Engineering Research Board, who will consider gender balance and bias in their review panels. And Dr. Seturaman Panch, Director of the National Science Foundation of the USA, also going to present and speak about the use of narrative CVs in NSF's research assessment process. So the evaluation of review and research is a central activity of research funders, and we do this for a variety, of course, for a variety of purposes, which include, of course, first and foremost, the selection of proposals for funding, but also research career progression, the evaluation of final or finished proposals, impact evaluation of funding programs, and so on. And for that purpose, the method of merit review has been developed or is most widely used and has been refined over the years. And I think it's worth starting giving a very brief introduction, just reminding us that the GRC, because this is a conference that is being run in the context of the Global Research Council. And the Global Research Council is actually very closely tied to discussions about research assessment methods. The very first GRC, which didn't have the name at that time, indeed took place in 2012. And it was on merit review. And what was at that time called the Global Summit, on merit review, a few high-level principles were endorsed by funders worldwide. And I think it was probably for the first time that funders agreed and publicly presented these high-level principles that should govern the research assessment processes, such as expert assessment, transparency, impartiality, the appropriateness of the processes, confidentiality, as well as integrity and ethical consideration. And this is, I think this was a very important moment, not only because the Global Research Council was established at that time, but also because it is good to define these high-level principles and make them public, because over and again, we are being asked as funders by the wider society, how do you select proposals? How do you select who will get funded, which projects will be funded, and which ones will not? And to be able to find an agreement, a worldwide agreement on high-level principle is something which is very important. Now, while these high-level principles provide some worldwide agreement at the fundamental level, they give little guidance as to how an assessment system should actually be organized and implemented. And that's where more our funding agencies and funders come in, because over the years we have established, over decades I should say, we have fine-tuned methods. Most of these methods do indeed rely on merit, or what we say peer review processes. And there is widespread sharing of best practices among funders. I think the conference that takes place over these 3 days, and in particular this panel as well, should serve in seeing where is the future, what are new methods, or what are new difficulties and new problem areas that we are currently facing, and where we can share good practices between funders and learn from each other. Science Europe, as an organization representing the funders, has done some work on that over the past years. So we started 2 years ago with assessing or making a survey on what are actually current assessment practices among our member organizations, which are really representative of all European funding agencies. And there are a number of interesting facts that came out, and some of these will be addressed, I hope, later in the discussion. We see that a large majority of funders use qualitative assessments, or at least a mixture of qualitative and quantitative assessments. So quantitative assessments being based basically on the evaluation of metrics. But it's good to see that a large number of funders still stick to more qualitative assessments, where proposals or projects are being discussed among peers. So and then recommendations are being made for funding decisions or not. We see that the very critical issue about bias is being more and more addressed, although it depends on which bias we are discussing. Gender bias, for instance, is something that has become where funders have become very prominently aware of, and where measures have been taken to, or many funders take measures to counter that bias. But there are other types of bias, particular diversity, which are less addressed, and which of course represent major challenges for the future. We also see that although organizations use by and large qualitative assessments, that the definition of criteria are not always very precise. For instance, 62% of organizations say that they assess projects based on research quality, but they fail to give a clear definition or a clear set of criteria on what they mean by research quality. We see in recent trends also that more and more organizations have started to broaden their scope when it comes to the research outputs that are evaluated, which in the past was very much biased towards publication and measured via publication metrics. And there is a general trend, certainly among European funders, to progressively move away from this monolithic view of evaluation criteria. And I think we'll hopefully hear more about that in the panel discussion. So just a few months ago, we issued recommendations. Science Europe issued recommendations on research assessment processes based on what we would consider current best practices. So that these recommendations came out of a survey from processes and practices of our membership. And it's of course it's more, I would say, the current picture of best practices, and this is something to build upon for the future. But nevertheless, funders, one of the recommendations or best practices that came out is that funders should actually regularly evaluate the robustness of their own evaluation processes. So evaluation processes within funding programs should regularly or from time to time be evaluated on whether they match or whether they fulfill the high-level criteria of what constitute a good practices and what constitute the basic principles or the fundamental principles of peer review. Bias or suppression of bias, discrimination, and unfair treatment remains high on the agenda. Whereas we have done, as I indicated, significant progress in reducing gender bias, there are many other forms of biases which, by and large, remain unaddressed, and where there is more work needs to be done. It's also, I think it's also very interesting to see that funders start experimenting with novel approaches, and we'll hear about it a little bit later. And I think that's very important. Funders should experiment with novel approaches during pilot process. We've seen novel approaches can be a variety. For instance, we've seen in some cases funders experimenting with lottery schemes in very well defined and precise circumstances. I think that should be encouraged, and we strongly encouraged it, but it's also as important as experimenting is that these results and experiences are shared with other funders, so that we don't start reinventing the wheel again over and again. So sharing these experiences among us is paramount, and that's also one of the reasons why these conferences at the level of the GRC are very useful and important. A topic to which we will come back during the discussion is about the pool of reviewers. We all see that well, this has to do with bias. How can we broaden the pool of reviewers to eliminate bias? But another issue that comes up is reviewer fatigue. I mean, we do solicit scientists more and more for review work, be it for funders, but also for publishing or for reviewing papers. And we should reflect on ways to recognize that work and make sure that that this is part of the or demonstrate that this is part of the activities of a researcher, but also recognize and reward it accordingly. There are other interesting recommendations which I don't want to go in detail to, because I think we will see much of these coming through during these discussions. And instead, I would now like to hand over to the colleagues that are on the panel with us, and I will start with Professor Angelika Kall from the Swiss National Science Foundation.
So thank you, Mark, and thank you for the organizers to invite me to this panel. So I was asked to say something specifically about narratives in the assessment process. So first of all, why does the SNSF, the Swiss National Science Foundation, use narratives? In fact, they're a part of a very much larger set of measures to achieve the following goals. First of all, we do want to assess researchers on their merits and not on the quality of the journals they publish in or on the institutions they work at. This is also clearly a recommendation of DORA. The second is to mitigate as much as possible bias during the assessment process. And the third is to increase diversity among the funded researchers of the Swiss National Science Foundation. So I would like to share with you 3 experiments we recently made. So the first is called SciCV. It's a pilot program we ran this year, which tests a new standardized CV format in the life sciences. So it's similar to what is done at the NIH or at the NSF. It contains narrative elements related to the project that people apply for and also to previous achievements. So researchers cannot provide a list of their publications. They can describe their major achievements. All outputs count, and applicants can only provide reference to papers that belong to these outputs. So this was quite new. So in parallel, we commissioned an evaluation of this entire process. The results are not there yet, but what is very interesting about it already now is the reaction of researchers and evaluators to this change. So what you can say is that researchers that have been, let's say, formatted in the classical way of handing in applications and of evaluating, they didn't like this narrative too much, whereas younger researchers that had not been too acquainted with the classical way of evaluating, where, for example, certain metrics in the publications count, they found this narrative part very, very good. And so we will see what the review of this process brings, but our plans are clearly to expand this also to other disciplines. And of course, that would then have to be adapted because there's not one size fits it all. The second example I want to give you is entirely different. It is related to the Marcel Benoit Prize. The Marcel Benoit Prize is Switzerland's most important research prize. It can be discerned to researchers of all disciplines, provided that their research has had an impact on humanity. And the Swiss National Science Foundation recently took over responsibility for this evaluation procedure. So it's a nomination prize, meaning that applicants cannot apply themselves, but they are in principle recommended by other researchers that have to hand in a text that describes why they nominate someone and which are the achievements and merits of that person. So again, a narrative used, not in the same way as in the SciCV, but what is interesting here is that the way you structure these narratives can have an implication on many things afterwards. So we structured it in 3 parts. First was on achievements. So the nominating person had to describe the achievements of the nominee, but really directly and not by relating to journal articles or to institutions or whatsoever. The second part was related to impact. So the nominators had to describe the impact of the scientific work of the nominee inside and outside academia. And the third part, which was not mandatory, was on prominence. So here they could describe what prizes the person had received at what prestigious universities or institutions he or she had worked, etc. Now, the first parts on achievement and impact had to be written in a fully anonymized and gender neutral way, referring to the nominee in the non-gendered form they. And then a panel assessed all of these recommendation texts, but only the anonymized parts, not the part on prominence. And only on this basis, a ranking list was, for example, established that served as a discussion in the panel meeting, and only afterwards was the identity of the people revealed, of the nominees. So what we can learn from this is that it can be very helpful to divide up narrative texts into sections, and in any case to anonymize the information as much as possible. So this clearly enhances both the discussion quality, but also gender balance. That was our observation. Now, the 2 examples I just gave you, they did not at all affect the diversity and the participation of the applicants, but maybe in the outcome. But another pilot we ran did, which is called Spark. So we launched 2 small calls for small projects to test new ideas immediately and only for 1 year. So in a very short evaluation process, only the idea and not the proposing person was evaluated in a double-blind review process. Also, there was no consensus finding in a committee, but everything was done by remote reviewers that got a set of applications. So what you can gather from this is that when track record is entirely removed from the assessment process, this does have a huge impact on the diversity of the participation. So we observed that many more women applied, many more young researchers applied, many more researchers doing youth-inspired research applied, and so about 80% of them were not known to the SNSF at all before. So these 3 examples, very different, each one were my input, and so I'm happy to take questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelika, and that offers very much material for the discussion later on. But I'll hand over now to Catherine Ngila from the African Academy of Sciences. Catherine.
So I started by basically just highlighting the fact that I am currently acting the executive director of the African Academy of Sciences, but I'm also on a leave of absence from Riara University, where I'm the deputy vice chancellor in charge of academic affairs. And so I wanted to look at some of the points that I considered important when I looked at the concept note. First is to look at my specific title is looking at the intersection of equality, but I've added gender because gender equality, diversity, and inclusion, they go hand in hand. So when you put the GENT together, then you are looking at, you can be able to holistically assess the research a performance in terms of how funders view research and what are the impact of the funding that funders are giving to specific institutions. And that looking at the African Academy of Sciences is important. Why? Because this is a continental academy, which is basically kind of affiliated with the African Union. And so we focus on transformation of lives in communities through science. And so if an organization is interested to come and fund specific projects in the continent, most of the funders, they would want to come and visit or contact the African Academy of Sciences just to understand what is the landscape in Africa, in the African countries, that is. And so I will also want to look at the strategy and the business plan that the Academy has in place in terms of delivering or implementing some of their strategic. Research management is one of the portfolios that we run in the Academy, particularly to empower institutions. And we look at some of the principles that we use, and also the interdependent variables that determine the success factors in research sustainability in Africa. And I will just, if time allows, just look at some of the research cases that I have had the experience. I've worked in South Africa. I am now in Kenya. So some of the, good message or points to take home. And of course, that is just the discussion areas, which I think is covering all of us. So I don't have to dwell on that. I just highlight, responses to some of the key issues, like, for example, how do funders make research assessment process clear? And I say that this is important in that funders should be able to clearly state as a criteria and procedure of the funding mechanism that they are going to follow. And of course, when you look at how do funders ensure accuracy and information, I say it is very important for funding organizations first to partner with local, local organizations on the ground. That way they can be able to correlate information. And answering the question of how do funders demonstrate and evaluate how they address bias discrimination, I said one way of doing that is data collection and interviews. Then answering the question of funders monitoring and evaluation and the robustness of the processes, I said, the research funding criteria should embed in the funders' policies and the procedures on how this can be done. That way it is very clearly measurable, whether it's measurable as qualitative as well as quantitative. Looking at the aspect of how funders streamline assessment processes to reduce burden, I said it is good first to have a database, and that is why the local partners in the country where the funding is going will be very important to look at the various areas and see who is available to do this. That way you reduce the burden. And in terms of how funders and appoint sustainably qualified diverse reviewers, I said the clear criteria is very important, whereby for you to be a reviewer, you must be able to tick the boxes. And if you do, then now you qualify to be able to be to do that. And I'm just trying to go to the next slide. Apparently this seems to be hanging up. So I'll probably just have to stop sharing again. I experience this problem once in a while. So again, sorry, colleagues, I just want to share again because like I said, that is a problem. I need to have to address that. So let's go to the next slide. and see whether that will work. Okay, so about the African Academy of Sciences, you know, our vision is transformed lives through science. How do we impact communities? And of course, we leverage that through research excellence and leadership in a sustainable way. Then also looking at what is the position of the academy, how is it positioned? Like I said initially, we are affiliated with the African Union. We partner with the African Union Development Agency and also new partnerships for Africa's development organization or agency. And so therefore, several governments affiliate us, you know, with the African Academy of Sciences because of where we positioned. Strategic planning and business plan for the academy. We have got a platform we call Alliance for Accelerating Excellence in Science in Africa, or in short AESA. But the goals of the AESA, which is actually our business plan, is first we build the research and development leadership and environment. Secondly, you have to support innovations and science-driven entrepreneur culture. 3, we have to look at identification and supporting rising researchers because these are the future leaders in terms of research. And then, of course, we look at what are the critical gaps that needs to be addressed. So that is one way we address that. So in terms of the 5 principles on how we do a research program management program, is first we go through the collaboration between and within African institutions and research institutions. We also look at capacity building with evidence-based benchmarking to address issues that are common across the sector and encourage institutions to develop structures. The Africa leadership supported by global expertise is very important, whereby we need to be able to benchmark ourselves, that is Africa researchers against international researchers, and also building on existing structures, expertise. Sometimes it's not good to reinvent the wheel. First, let's look at what is in existence. And then, of course, we look at a long-term approach to research management. And so some of the interdependent variables that determine the success factors for the building effective, sustainable research management at institutional level is one of the areas is to look at the institutional leadership. Is that we have a good leadership, we have research offices, so forth and so on. Basically, the whole ecosystem in a given institution that we are funding. Long-term commitment is very important, high quality, standard, and good practice. And of course, we have to take on cognizance of the fact that individual capacity development is very important. That way we can be able to eliminate marginalized sectors of the communities because of historical imbalances. And so I've already mentioned the institutional leadership, sustainability, individual capacity, and the standards that are usually clearly stipulated. In particular, the issue of the intersection of gender, equality, diversity, and inclusion in research assessment, I said it's very important to look at, as we look at the impact of funding, we should take into account a complete ecosystem, that is the science, technology, and the innovation priorities, infrastructure support, research ecosystem in terms of stakeholders, individuals, institutions, existing partners, collaborators, sponsors, donors, surrounding institution, communities, so forth. Policy and skills training and mentorship is very important. Now, specifically, if we have to address the gender parity and equity, diversity, and inclusion, we have to worry about not just the hardware in terms of our funding, but also look at the software. And the software of research is looking at the soft skills training, particularly early career researchers, which we abbreviate as ECRs. Multidisciplinarity of the research projects, very important, looking at natural sciences, social science, humanities, and arts, because otherwise a project, for it to have an impact on a given community, all those factors must be put in place. Collaborative projects must be put so that you can be able to pair historically advantaged institutions and disadvantaged institutions. I see that a lot in South Africa, the National Research Foundation. Whenever they set out a research funding, they will say that you have to partner. Show evidence that you have got partnership in historically disadvantaged institutions, particularly if you are the applicant, you are the main principal researcher, and you are coming from historically advantaged institutions. Marginalized communities are very important to look into. These are rural institutions whereby infrastructure is very poor. Role modeling is very important. I've already said that. The culture of the community where this institution that we are funding is situated. Character and integrity is very important. Is there any evidence of corruption? Because that is a disease. And of course, the women issues in the sectionality, women face overlapping disadvantages and discrimination related to sexism and racism. These are issues that we need to be able to pay attention, researchers to better understand and address the multiple barriers and disadvantages that individuals with intersecting social identities such as race, gender, sexuality, class face, all these are facing. Using intersectional approach to develop policies is very important. And basically, if you look at in terms of African countries, you have to ask yourself, how prepared are we in terms of research infrastructure? The World Bank says that Africa produces only 1% of global scientific knowledge, yet we constitute 16% of the global population. So there has to be something that is not happening properly. And so therefore, research funders have to pay attention to some of these things. If you look at a case study of the South African National Research Foundation, you see that they are very holistically in terms of their approach in funding, because that is the funding organization or agency which is under the Ministry of Science and Technology and Innovation in South Africa. And they support a whole range of areas, promoting, advancing research and human capacity development. They give scholarships to students, developing, supporting, and mainstreaming or maintaining national research facilities. Equipment is very important. And of course, mobility funding. For example, people need to be able to travel and partner with other institutions globally, and promoting development and maintenance of national science ecosystem. There's some of the criteria in terms of evaluation, whether you have achieved, is to look at the research outputs that are coming from those institutions that have been funded, dissemination of the research funding, findings rather, the impact on communities, as well as also NSF rating. National Research Foundation has got a rating system. If you are funded by NRF, then you need to be able to be, not necessarily to be rated, but you should be preparing yourself to be rated. And they look at a whole range of factors that warrant one to be rated. Research awards are some of the incentives they put in place to ensure that people aspire to apply for grants and funding, and also improve their citations. Women in Science Research Awards, that is now trying to address the gender parities. And of course, we talked about the mobility funds, and this is very common now to measure quality research. I think it's very, very standard. Journal impact factors, H index, citations, so forth and so on. Appearance in Google Scholars, ResearchGate, Scopus, and all that. And of course, these are the multinational funding organizations that usually fund Africa through the African Academy of Sciences. So the African Academy of Sciences will receive funding so that we can be able to disseminate this funding to various institutions in the whole of Africa. Thank you.
And we will now have the contribution from Dr. Seturaman Panch, who is the director of the National Science Foundation in the US, who uses narrative CVs in their assessment processes.
It is an honor to be the 15th director of the National Science Foundation. This is a thrilling time to step into this role. It is a time of challenges that we are all navigating, but it is also a time of opportunities where we can look ahead to great things to come in discovery and innovation. If we leverage the power of partnership, people, and translation, we can match the achievements of the last 70 years in the next decade. Accomplishing this goal will require maintaining a robust global research ecosystem that is rooted in the highest standards of research integrity. NSF is committed to fostering the core high-level principles that have been affirmed by the Global Research Council, which are necessary for a rigorous and transparent review system. Adherence to these principles will ensure open and reciprocal international collaborations and will provide a strong foundation from which the greatest scientific advancements will arise. Research integrity and the principles of merit review, including expert assessment, transparency, impartiality, confidentiality, etc., are the guiding principles of NSF's current operations. They're also at the heart of my vision for the agency's future. We are in a defining moment, and I see an immense opportunity for global collaboration to push forward the progress of science, engineering, and technology in improving the lives of individuals around the world. My strategic vision for the agency's future rests on 3 pillars: advancing the research into the future, ensuring inclusivity and accessibility, and continuing global leadership in science and engineering. First, NSF's central focus will always be to advance the frontiers of knowledge by supporting basic research projects that are high risk, high reward. This is who we are. Science is an endless frontier, and I believe in seeding bold, large-scale foundational research with meaningful societal impact. Second, the best science is shaped by a wide range of perspectives and experiences that are informed by different backgrounds. If we want to cultivate a robust science and engineering enterprise, ensuring accessibility and inclusivity in STEM must be a priority. Third, by seeding strategic investments, we will steer the frontiers of discovery and innovation towards breakthroughs that improve quality of life around the world. I believe that our nation can enrich the global research environment by being in the vanguard of principled research leadership. To accomplish this vision, we will need dynamic partnerships. Partnerships are an opportunity to accelerate our progress and amplify the benefits of basic research. International collaboration, in my mind, is central to achieving my vision. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we are witnessing the importance of cooperating across political borders to spur advancements in science and engineering. We must harness talent across the globe in order to accelerate progress. Of course, we must also expand our partnerships to include the private sector, nonprofits, as well as within our respective governments. Partnerships are a methodology for strengthening, scaling, and speeding our advancements. They are like the turbocharging engine of the research enterprise. International collaboration has always been at the heart of scientific progress, and NSF's priority is to foster a global scientific ecosystem that is both secure and open. When the outbreak hit, we knew that any research response to a global pandemic would necessarily need to entail global collaboration. NSF worked with the White House to convene calls with the chief science advisors from around the globe, and from late March through late August, tracked and shared worldwide non-medical COVID-19 research information. Additionally, dozens of NSF awards involved international collaboration, including one NSF-funded project that studied wastewater-based epidemiological monitoring of SARS-CoV-2 with collaborating groups from around the world. We are also aware that this global pandemic has had big implications for how we organize international research collaboration. That is why NSF's Office of International Science and Engineering is currently inviting proposals for research projects that look into the future of international research collaboration post-COVID-19. Though global research collaboration is perhaps more important now than ever, the principles of research integrity which underpin these partnerships are increasingly being threatened. NSF, along with its international partners, have been looking for ways to protect the integrity of research and intellectual property while preserving openness and international collaboration in research. The recent JASON report, which NSF commissioned from an independent group of specialists with expertise in both science and security, has outlined the scope of the threat and identified ways that governments and scientists can do more to protect research security. In response, NSF has looked to how we can strengthen our processes to uphold the principles of research integrity. Since the release of the report in December, NSF has clarified its terms and conditions for disclosing sources of support to guard against conflicts of interest. We have also created a new position, the Chief of Research Security Strategy and Policy, which Rebecca Kaiser now holds, and stood up a leadership level research security strategy team. Looking ahead, we plan to continue outreach and collaboration with the academic research community, leverage data and analytics to support research security, and uphold the principles of our merit review process. From ensuring that reviewers have appropriate expertise and make merit-based evaluations that are free from potential unconscious biases, to ensuring transparency in the review process through clearly stated rules that are shared widely, these principles play an important role in research support and management worldwide. I also want to emphasize the importance of ensuring inclusivity and accessibility in STEM to strengthening the research system. As the GRC's shared principles of merit review reflect, research integrity depends on the inclusion of underrepresented groups. There is currently tremendous untapped STEM potential throughout the world. We will need every person with STEM capabilities in order to meet the needs of the future workforce and drive the innovations of tomorrow. I believe that diversity enriches innovation to solve problems. It is our role as research funders to ensure accessibility and inclusivity in STEM, because the quality of science depends on broad participation. It is going to require a huge amount of collaboration and intentional strategic actions to harness this talent. It won't happen unless it is a foreground priority. That is why I'm making it a focus of my tenure as NSF director to strengthen and scale existing STEM pathways. As funding bodies, it is our duty to maintain and strengthen these merit review processes while adapting to a constantly shifting economic, political, and social landscape. It is more important now than ever to bring together multidisciplinary scientific expertise in order to effectively address societal challenges. NSF is promoting convergent research through funding opportunities like the Convergent Accelerator Program, which addresses transformative research areas of national importance such as quantum technology and AI. Given the lessons learned from the current global health crisis, we know that we will also need to improve the resiliency of our research ecosystem. There is widespread concern about the lasting impact on early career scientists and engineers and on the entire research enterprise. We as leaders must take the time to identify how we can improve the research enterprise so that we walk away from this pandemic stronger than ever. I believe that NSF, along with the members of the Global Research Council, has a unique opportunity to envision a recovery that is not simply a return to normal, but instead allows the emergence of a stronger, more equitable enterprise that delivers a brighter future. I am an optimistic by nature, and I look for the positive in every situation. The research community is already displaying resilience under tremendous pressure. It makes me proud to be a scientist. Our job right now is to support this community. And that's what we're working to do. We can support the scientific community by continuing to expand opportunities and implementing the greatest flexibilities possible to accommodate current challenges. We can also support the long-term health of the community by ensuring that our review processes are balanced so that high-risk, high-reward proposals may be considered. This will ensure that we continue to seek and support bold new research ideas that advance discovery. As I previously mentioned, adherence to these principles of merit review, which have been affirmed by the Global Research Council, will provide a strong foundation from which the greatest scientific advancements will arise. I call on the global research community to join us in building open and reciprocal international collaborations as we push forward the progress of science, engineering, and technology to improve the lives of individuals around the world. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank all the panel members for their. I thank all the panel members for their contributions. Very interesting, and there is a lot of input here to continue the discussion. Maybe what was very interesting in Angelica's 3 examples that they have put in place at the Swiss National Science Foundation is about how and with this prize, for instance, or with the Spark project, how the fact that that the applications, or at least part of the first stage of such applications, are when they are anonymized and written in a gender neutral way, and possibly also for the second example, if there is a double blind way for evaluating proposals, that this actually seems to enlarge the group of applicants. So I would like to ask Angelica whether this is this something which we can more generally, or which you would suggest in the future to more generally use this more anonymized, more neutral, gender and possibly diverse group neutral and seniority neutral applications. Do you think that's something which in your foundation you are considering extending to other programs?
Yes, Mark, thank you for that question. I think we're definitely going for that, but first we have to make sure that there is really evidence it works. What we do have at the moment is just evidence that there is, for example, gender bias in the usual evaluation process. For example, we have been monitoring all of the external reviews that have come in the last, I think, 15 years or something like that, or 10 years, I don't remember. And so what you can observe there is that there is a clear difference in the assessment of proposals that come from women versus proposals that come from men. And what you can see is that both reviewers, if reviewers are men and if reviewers are women, they rate the man better. But the difference in this rating is very much more pronounced when there is a man evaluating than when there is a woman evaluating, but is nevertheless there. And we can also see is that women in general give much more stricter grades to proposals than men do. So what I would like to answer to this question is that we have enough evidence of what doesn't work, or what leads to bias, or where bias is, and what the consequences can be. Now we have to try out these new methods, and then we have to evaluate them carefully. And then at the end, we will better understand what works and why it works. If I could just add something, for the Spark double-blind review process, for example, we had been hoping for that in the evaluation itself, the outcome would be that women would have a higher percentage of granted grants at the end than they had in our usual processes. This was not at all the case. The participation of women got up, and that's why at the end they also got more grants, but it was not that anything had really fundamentally changed probably during evaluation. But now we're examining, for example, how women are writing the proposals. Are they writing them in the different way than men are? Are they like kind of, not I would say, not putting forward their achievements in the same way that men are, or are they formulating things that seem less appealing to the reviewers? So it's a very complicated business, and until you really know what works and why it works, it will take us still quite some time. And there is resistance to it, that's very clear. Because when you look at the burden of the evaluation process, then of course there are always voices that ask to continue with the publication lists and the metrics and so on, because it makes your life easier as a reviewer. So that's my input for the moment, I think, to this
Very
question.
good, thank you. Well, maybe we can come back to the, if time permits, to the acceptance, both on the acceptance questions, both on the side of the reviewers and on the side of the applicants. Catherine, what was very interesting presentation as well, and of course on the African continent you're certainly faced with also with the same type of bias and discrimination issues. So one I took up, which is something that we don't know or which is not so on our minds here, is the example of the National Research Fund in South Africa, about these where there is a kind of there are these attempts, or there is this willingness to suppress bias or negative bias against what you called historically disadvantaged institutions. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? How is it done? How effective is it? Do you have evidence that this actually then leads to a better inclusion of these institutions, and also maybe about the acceptance? What's the acceptance with respect to other institutions to that?
No, thank you very much, Mark. One thing we have to realize, particularly appreciate about the NRF, that is the National Research Foundation in South Africa, is that over time they have looked at statistics and they have seen that women, a percentage in terms of statistics, women are fewer in getting funding. And so what they have done is to make a concerted effort to ensure that women, you specifically address, and you are deliberately trying to put mechanism in place to ensure that we encourage women, you mentor women, give them incentives. One of the areas that I admire about South Africa, particularly the National Research Foundation, is that sometimes when they send out the call for funding, they will say women are given priorities in some of the proposals, a call for funding. Areas such as awards, we have got Women in Science Awards, Young Women in Science Awards. I am one of the recipients of the Women Awards, Science Awards, in 2016. Where you get a category. They have got different categories. That is women in physical sciences and engineering. Another category is biological sciences. Another category, and sciences and physical sciences, mathematics and engineering, and then biological sciences, humanities, that is social sciences, humanities, and arts, so forth and so on. So that kind of brings everybody on board, so that you don't feel that if you are doing, because we believe that women tend to be more in the social sciences, humanities, and arts. So if you are a woman and you're in those areas, you also stand a chance of getting awards. And so therefore you don't feel disadvantaged just because you're there. Mentorship is one of the areas in South Africa that is very much, it's actually inputted into the research funding, such that it is indicated there that mentorship is encouraged. So if, for example, I get a funding as an established researcher, if I get funding, I know that some of the money that I get from the National Research Foundation, and particularly if you have to show what you have managed to do in terms of output, is to show who have you mentored. Have you mentored women? Have you mentored young women researchers, so forth and so on, so that you know that whoever woman gets this, or even men, for example, they get funded, they must also show, have you mentored women, young women researchers? So these are some of the areas that I admire about the system of the National Research Foundation in South Africa, which has implemented all these aspects to ensure that there is no discrimination in terms of, and then also when they send out the call, they say that you must partner with historically disadvantaged universities or institutions. These are historically Black institutions, as if you understand South Africa, the history of the apartheid system. So the apartheid system, of course, disadvantaged the Black communities. Now, whenever you are applying for funding, if you are in a historically advantaged institution, you must show evidence that you are partnering with historically disadvantaged communities. So these are some of the areas that aspects they put in place to ensure this discrimination and biases are reduced. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. So I think this is also very, very interesting and important that we broaden it is within the topic of broadening what we consider research outputs in the broader sense, and things that what you mentioned about mentoring, and this is a specific question which funders ask. Have you mentored, in particular, have you mentored young women researchers? I suppose that in one of the examples which Angelica showed about this prize, about the Marcel Benoit Prize, where it's actually not the nominations actually have to come from someone else. So maybe there are former mentees that will write such a nomination. We are in my agency, we are experimenting now with a scheme where we actually do contact former mentees of applicants and ask whether they would provide a recommendation or an assessment letter. Now, all this is very interesting, but as Angelica mentioned, and I would briefly like to come back to that. To what extent is resistance both on the side, or do you perceive resistance both on the side of the applicants and also of the reviewers? You mentioned that at least for some of these novelties, there seems to be a divide between the youngers and the young researchers and the more established ones. So is that something which is of concern and which we should find ways to overcome?
So I can just add to that I think that every change, encompasses resistance from a part of the people concerned, because they have very well worked and functioned in the system that exists. So I guess it's something that you have to pay attention to, but that shouldn't necessarily keep you from going in the direction of really doing qualitative assessment and of looking at what people have really achieved. But on the other hand, there is also a discussion on if there may be reasonable metrics that you could use that are article-based, for example, that do say something perhaps about the quality of this piece of research work that you could use. So this could kind of be a compromise between what some people that have more, let's say, that are more familiar with the system, how it's currently working, would maybe buy into. So I think there's some compromise to be found, but you do have to do this work of convincing people, and every time you do change, not only with this topic.
Sorry. Okay, well, thank you. Catherine, briefly on resistance within the system from your experience. Are these measures to include more women, to include historically disadvantaged institutions, are they well accepted, or did you see resistance over the years?
I think research in institutions and also in research centers, they come a long way. This didn't just start yesterday. You'd realize that maybe historically you would find that women were disadvantaged, and that is why the statistics were showing that not many women are applying for funding. The other thing that we also have to take into account is the role women play in communities, particularly in the African setting. So South Africa's system takes into account of that. And Kenya now, I'm happy that the National Research Fund and the National Commission for Science and Technology and Innovation is also working very closely with South Africa, so that they can also be able to borrow some of these good practices that are taking place. So to answer your question, do we have historical, biases as to what was happening? I don't have statistics with me, but I can almost be 100% sure that these new measures that came into place to factor in some of the gender issues in the research funding by the National Research Foundation was as a result of what was happening historically or what was happening previously. But things have improved, where you realize that actually a big percentage of girls who are finishing maybe first years in the science and technology are women. These are girls who are, or rather students who are finishing, a large percentage is women. Women now start only decreasing when you go up. Master's, PhD, particularly PhD and postdoctoral, you find that they're less. But you can also understand why, because of the biological life cycle of women. That is maybe the time that they are very busy with families. So yes, these are aspects that have been noticed, and I'm sure that now they are trying to correct some of these imbalances. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, it's already close to the end, but we will have in the Q&A sessions more hopefully more interesting discussions. Let me very briefly wrap up. So we touched upon some of these novelties and innovations that funders are trying to implement. I think it's extremely important that we share these experiences so that others can take up from them and others can learn from them. I think it's equally important because we discussed a little bit the resistance within the system. So I think it's equally important to demonstrate and to collect data and demonstrate that actually there is an effect, so that we, by taking certain measures, doing certain changes, that actually we can reduce biases in our assessment and evaluation proposals, and probably set the whole proposal more on a scientific basis, which is something that hasn't been done enough to actually demonstrate on a more scientific basis that our processes are robust. And I think that's a wide field which is open for future developments, and where I know that quite a number of funders are working on. Okay, I thank all the participants in this panel very much for their valuable contributions, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A live session that will follow. Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers as well.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm happy to join again this event with the live Q&A panel on funders' research assessment processes. My name is Mark Schultz. I'm the president of Science Europe and also the executive head of the Luxembourg National Research Fund. And with me on the panel are Angelika Kalt, the director of the Swiss National Science Foundation, and Jane Catherine Ngila, deputy vice chancellor of Riara University and also member of the African Academy of Sciences. And Claire Fraser from UKRI will guide us through the questions here this afternoon. So Claire, I think we are happy to hear the first question.
Thanks, Mark. So we've had a few questions around the training that you've provided to panels based on your experience, and in particular, the attendees were particularly interested in the guidance that you give to reviewers and panelists when they were evaluating narrative CVs for the first time. So I wonder if you could reflect on your experience and what guidance you were able to give your reviewers and panels.
Okay, very good, thank you. Maybe more specific to the narrative CV, I think Angelika, you're in the perfect position to answer that question, and then maybe we can actually broaden it to myself and Catherine as well on the more general training and guidance that we give to reviewers. Angelika, what guidance do you give to reviewers and panelists to use these narrative CVs that you have experimented with? We can't hear you, Angelika. I think you're still muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Mark, for the question. As I said in the panel, we are currently experimenting with this. So please don't take my answer as that of someone who has years and years of experience with narrative CVs. So it is very important to stress the fact that, first of all, there is nothing else to be evaluated except for the information that is given in these narrative CVs. It is extremely important that evaluators don't, for example, consult entire publication lists and so on, but they really stick to what is given as information in these narrative CVs that may be completed by other information. But that is the first thing that is very important to say. This is the frame, you're acting within this framework, and this is what you're evaluating and nothing else. And that is quite a difference to habits that researchers have had before, where they then look at the web and see what people have published and so on. So it's really stick to this framework. That I would say is the first thing. And then the second thing is to say, okay, this is something that people say about themselves. So of course you have to look at this with a critical distance. You do not necessarily have to agree with the contribution that somebody, for example, describes as being major or very important. So have a critical distance to what is told there, and use your own knowledge and your own reference system to put that in your frame. I would say these are the two most important things. Refrain from doing the things you were maybe used to do before. Stick to the frame, and then be aware of the fact that this is a very subjective piece of text that is provided by the applicants. I think for the moment that's what I can say. And of course, then there's all other forms of guidance for evaluation in panels and so on. I'm not speaking about that now, but just specifically about the narrative context.
Also, if I can broaden that question just a little bit, maybe Catherine, you can also share on what's your experience in briefing reviewers and panelists to take into account some of these aspects on that you mentioned in your presentation last time, like diversity and also respect for less favored institution. How do you go about? Do you give them a special briefing, or what's your experience on that?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. From my experience as a reviewer and also as a panel chair, is that we usually receive in advance the criteria against which we are going to evaluate the applicants. Very important, of course, the scorecard. The scorecard is specific to say which areas that you should be looking at. There is always that danger where you would want to, people tend to be subjective sometimes, particularly more so if you know who the applicants are. That is can be very dangerous. But also sometimes based on the CVs or the, people's resumes that you have received, it is also important sometimes to listen to people present. Just yesterday, I was seated in a selection criteria for the chief editor in one of the journals, and looking at what was in the CV and listening to the person do the presentation, you could tell there's a big difference. So that opportunity for interviews is also very important. So I think it is basically looking at the format, looking at the policy and procedure in terms of panel evaluations. So there's a scorecard, be objective, and then of course you pay attention particularly to the presentations. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Claire, I think we're ready to take another question.
Great. So one of the participants commented that if women write proposals differently, shouldn't we be dedicating efforts to train reviewers to identify and account for that, rather than getting women to write like men? And then another participant commented that narrative CVs might exacerbate certain inequalities, since writing style will now become the new, what they call impact currency. Do the panelists have any comments or reflections on these two comments?
Very interesting question, thank you. Yes, Catherine, maybe if I can come back to you, if should with these gender neutral present or proposals or written, which are written in a gender neutral way, is there a risk, you think, that we start that coming in a situation where women researchers write proposals like men researchers, or is it relevant?
Well, there are differences in between men and women the way we write. I think women tend to be very frank, and what they write somehow it reflects what they actually are doing or what they have done or what they have achieved. as opposed to Mayo, you know, you would find that somebody would do a small piece of project, but they'll blow it up out of proportion so that it looks like that is all they have done in their entire life. And whereas women don't do that a lot, because women are very sensitive in terms of not blowing their own trumpets. So those are some of the areas, but I think, and I'm glad that you have asked that question, because I also 2 days ago, I was sitting listening to evaluations of applicants for grantee applicants, and they were given an opportunity to present the CVs that had already been submitted. And you would find that, listen to one of the ladies, I could tell that she's not she's not coming from English-speaking country. So that was taken into account, but it's the way she was expressing herself. I could tell that this one is speaking from the heart. When I listened to the mayor was actually talking. CV has done it, but actually is just reading what he has already copied from the internet. So we have to be aware of this, you know, maybe we can call them unconscious biases, whereby you have to be sensitive about the differences, the gender differences between the applicants. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Angelica, narrative CVs. Is there a risk that this will favor those who have an eloquent writing style rather than those who have scientific talent?
There's a certain risk, but you have to handle the risk as the same as Catherine said before. You have to provide this training to the reviewers and to the panelists that make them aware of the fact that women write their proposals and present themselves differently than men, and that this is not better or worse or whatsoever. It's just different, and that they need to take into account that normally by external reviews, for example, the rating women get for their CVs is normally lower than those that men get. So yes, narratives have this risk, but my take on it is you have to cope with the risk. You have to do these sensibilization exercises, awareness exercises. And concerning the point now with the, let's say, the overselling point in writing, so this is the phenomenon that has been known before there were narrative CVs. So you can find that in the proposal where people explain what they've did before, related scientific to the proposal, etc. So this is not necessarily a problem that is new with the narrative CVs. And of course, today with all of the text mining analysis possibilities and that you can show this. And so I think it's not yet done, but there may be a kind of a oversell check or something like that when you look at proposals in the future. But you have to cope with these things. I think there's no way of, not having them.
Very good. Well, that's an interesting idea for the future, and an oversell check to see that should be possible with modern technology. Actually, very good. Claire, do we have another question?
We do. So, does the panel think that the results of all evaluations and the reports from those evaluations should be published to increase transparency? And how do you think we should balance this with a need for privacy?
Okay, well, maybe I can make a comment to that as well. I have no definite opinion on that, but I think there are drawbacks that we should consider, because people write differently when they know that it's going to be made public. Now, that can be for the better or for the worse. So in the sense, people are probably less outspoken if they know that the report will be made public. This being said, I can in our agency, we have a tradition to be fully transparent with the applicants. So we share all the complete reviews with the applicants, of course, in an anonymized way, but they get the full text, not just the summary. And of course, they can do with that what they want. So if they want to share it with others or make it public, that's their right. But I know in other agencies, it's not. There are other rules. So I think it's something that needs to be balanced. I, in principle, would tend more for the transparency to the transparency side, but there are caveats to that as well. Angelica, would you like to add something to that?
Yes, thank you. So first of all, I think it depends on the legal context of the country where you're in. For example, in Switzerland, we are bound to keep the names of reviewing people anonymous, where in the Scandinavian Nordic countries, for example, they just have to do the contrary. So it depends on the legal context. But I think that within the legal context, you should be as transparent as possible. For example, we also pass the external reviews on to the applicants. And in some instruments, we even have a rebuttal system where people can reply. But all of this is anonymous. So then the name of the reviewing person is not known. And then I think it is very important that if you're transparent, that you not only give documents and reviews, but you provide the context, because very often researchers don't understand who is responsible for what in this entire process. For example, when you have external reviews and then you have the panel meeting and then maybe even another body that takes the decision. I mean, it can be very different from organization to organization. So along with the transparency, you have to be very transparent about the process too. And I think you should be as transparent as possible.
Very good. Catherine, any thoughts about that on publishing reviewer reports and be fully transparent about panel conclusions or discussions?
Yeah, I've got mixed feelings. Usually I've got mixed feelings about a reviewer's comments. Sometimes reviewers, okay, if they know that the applicant is going to see the comments, they tend to be they sugarcoat, statements, verdict and all that. But when you know you're anonymous completely, you tend to just be brutally honest and say that this is, wasn't happy about this. The applicant did 1, 2, 3. So, but again, also, I would also agree that with Kathy, that it is important actually to, let the reviewers know upfront from the beginning that this might be published. Would you want your name to be published when the review process is finished? And that we also see that in the thesis, when you are reviewing thesis for students. You sometimes they ask you whether you would want your name to be reviewed or not. So anyway, once you know from the beginning, then you will tailor-make your language. But for me, if I was to be asked the way forward, I would say just leave it anonymous, but give the comments without the names. Thank you.
Okay, very good, thank you. So I think there is a difference here, or maybe a distinction to be made whether what is made public is kept anonymous or not. And as Angelica says, there may be different traditions in different countries. Very good. Claire, another question.
Thanks, Mark. So what are the best practices and processes for assessing the potential for research impact?
Okay, well, that is a broad question, I shall say. So I suppose the question focuses on assessing research impact versus what we may call scientific quality or scientific excellence, and the more broader perspective. I don't know, my colleagues, do you have any input on that, Angelica?
Well, that is a difficult question. Usually when somebody proposes to do research, this is a kind of open-ended endeavor. So nobody can really guarantee what's going to come out at the end. And many important scientific discoveries have been made by serendipity, meaning that people have found other things that they had been planning to even look for. And so the Swiss National Science Foundation, for example, is relatively open. Of course, we try to figure out if something will have, let's say, a large impact in a research community. And we also give people the possibility to say, my research is use-inspired, meaning I expect a broader impact. And then they also get rated on that. And so basically, all of this is a kind of a self-explanation that researchers provide in their proposals. And then what is done in principle is that you rate the proposal on the self-declaration and whether you think that the self-declaration is realistic or not. But the Swiss National Science Foundation does not have the broader impact criterion for all proposals, only for proposals that maintain themselves that they will have an impact beyond academia. And if not, it is the impact beyond inside academia, inside the research field, the larger research field that is being taken into account in evaluation. Now, the best practice is how to evaluate that. That is really very difficult. So you can, for example, look at the potential of the person to produce such results. If somebody has already in the past produced such results, but you can also come from the field and say, okay, if this works, what the person proposes, this will be a huge step forward, for example, in that field. So it is always weighing the risk related to the research with a reward that is related to it. But there's no simple recipe to it. There's no simple recipe to it, and I would say evaluation is not really an entirely objective undertaking. It's always subjective in a certain sense that there's human beings are doing it. So any evaluator will have also a kind of a different perception on what is high impact and what is low impact. But you can guide by a couple of questions that you ask. What we've been seeing in general is that the more focused the questions are that you ask the evaluators, the more let's say, the more they explain their rationale why they give a good grade or a bad grade, the more open you leave the text field in order for people to explain something, the less you get. So that's our recent analysis that has been very clear. So I don't have the very best practices, but just some hints to it. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Catherine, any thoughts on that? Evaluation of impact, so longer term impact, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting that we're discussing this because in our institution today, we had a monitoring and evaluation from all departments. And as you are aware, at the moment, I'm acting the executive director for the African Academy of Sciences. And of course, we receive funding and we give to the grantees, and then the grantees, they do their work. And from there, we have to evaluate the success of these projects. So the criteria there has to be a framework from the beginning. Upfront, there's a framework upon which, these grants have been given and what are the expected outputs and the targets. And so for me, in the evaluation, first, we have to look at what you started with, the framework, what was intended outputs. We had a discussion, and when the heads of departments were talking of how the students have graduated, and maybe the students have also managed to probably move on to get good jobs and things like that. And then I said, okay, fine. That is at an individual level. Have you also looked at the impact it has in the institution where that person is? Have you also looked at the community within which that institution is located? Does it have an impact on the community engagement and so forth and so on? So I wanted us to be looking at a broader framework, particularly when we are allocating funding, because this funding, let's say, is coming from Gates Foundation, or it's coming from UK DFID. So we need to be able to say, okay, from the beginning, let's get the framework very clearly. Let's look at the expected targets, and also let's look at the impact, but in a broader sense and in a long term, but short term, mid term, and as well as long term. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Angelica, you would like to add something?
Yes, because I'm not sure about the question anymore. Because of course, when you develop instruments and funding schemes, you can of course say what impact they have had afterwards by, for example, monitoring what happened to the grantees and what kind of scientific results came out. But I was answering to the question, how do you do that in a proposal when something is proposed to you? And I think that is much more different and much more difficult. And that was the question that I was answering to. Of course, then ex post you can always.
Yeah, I agree. So ex ante is somewhat more challenging. There seem to be a few factors, nevertheless, which various studies have brought up. For instance, co-creation or early engagement with relevant societal or industry stakeholders seem to be good signals for potential impact later on. So there are some flags or some criteria which are actually founded on studies which can be used, but it's anything but straightforward or clear. And I know some funding agencies also they have different evaluation panels. For instance, they have a separate evaluation. They have separate evaluation panels, one for the purely scientific aspects, and then another one with different type of people to assess potential impact. So that's maybe one way to organize such a process of having, because the experience is that those that can judge the scientific merit of a proposal are probably just essentially focusing on that part and maybe less on the potential impact part. So separating these panels or these evaluation steps or stages is one way which has been pioneered by some of the funding agencies. I don't know, we have 5 minutes. Can we still have a very short question?
I think we can fit one more in. So there's a question about experimental funding methodologies. So do the panelists have any experience directly of using kind of more experimental funding methodologies? And if so, what have the panelists learned so far and what advice would they give? So I'm guessing that means more kind of lottery-based funding methodologies or sandpits and other varieties of methodologies. Thanks, Mark.
Yes, thank you. Well, that's a broad question as well, but so I wouldn't necessarily restrict it to lotteries, because I think methodologies like the one that I just mentioned, where you test with different panels to assess different criteria, I think that's some kind of novel or experimental methodology as well. Of course, there has been much discussion about the lottery. I think experimental is what the Swiss Science Foundation did with the new type of narrative, because there is an evaluation stage behind it. Angelika, if you briefly can comment from which you will learn, I suppose, and try to then modify things, and so I think these new evaluation types are somewhat iterative. So we try things and then we change it a little bit, and then we go to the next stage.
Yes, Mark, effectively that is what we're currently doing. So we launch pilots, we call them, either an instrument, either a way of evaluating. Then we do this like 1 or 2 times, and then we see what comes out, and then we evaluate it, and then we see if we keep it or if we modify it. So, for example, for the narrative CV, this has only been tried out in the life sciences, because there it already exists. The NIH is doing this since quite some time. And now the question is, how can we adapt this, for example, to other fields that need other narratives, other types of narratives, maybe other ways of evaluating it. So this is currently ongoing. But then, of course, there are always discussions on how to introduce new things in the evaluation system. So lottery is, for example, one. We've been introducing this when it comes to really drawing the funding line, and when you have a small number of proposals where very obviously nobody can really decide which one is the best. So that is something that has encountered quite some resistance, but it has been accepted now. But we also have introduced, for example, a very straightforward statistical system when people vote and give grades to establish ranking lists, and then really see if there are differences between groups and so on. So all these kinds of things. But I think the main human factor is to follow DORA in principle, and to refrain from using the usual publication metrics for rating people. I think that's the most significant change that is currently happening.
Yeah, I can only confirm that. I think we also in my organization, in our organization, we put a lot of emphasis on DORA now. We systematically, brings us back to the first question, systematically at the beginning of at the start of a panel meeting, we recall principles. We also tend to train and our panel chairs on being careful, because it's hard work. I mean, these habits about bibliometric metrics are so entrenched now that that it needs recalling the principles over and again to stand up in a panel and say, well, we're not looking at citations, we're not looking at these kind of parameters. So I think it will take time to really change the culture. But I think we've all started it, or most funders have started it. I think we're unfortunately at the end, Claire, is that at the end of our time. So let me thank my co-panelists, Catherine and Angelica, and I hope we could add a few insight thoughts about funders' review and assessment processes. And you have understood, I think you have understood that this is a topic which is very much on the agenda of funders, where we experiment, where we try to implement and drive the change in research culture. Thank you to all those out there, wherever in the world, and I wish you a nice continuation on this workshop. And thanks to my co-panelists.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Angelica, and of course our listeners. Thank you, the organizers, Claire and team.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you to everyone. Bye.